Welcome to Bat Therapy, mental health through the lens of comics and film. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We are your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. All right, so our psychology spotlight, I thought what could be really cool for this time around, we talked about the different live action portrayals of Bruce Wayne. And so we were talking about the different versions of his personality and how he presents his Bruce Wayne and how much of it is true to him versus, presenting it for the people around him, all that jazz.
Yeah.
So I thought it could be interesting to talk about what the heck is personality? Like how do you define a person's personality?
Okay.
Because we talk about people and who they are all the time, but psychology is all about how do we measure these things about people and who they are and what they do. And so personality can be a little bit of a hard one to put your finger on.
Oh gosh, that's really good. That's really
Right?
good because
Yeah.
thinking about like describing someone's personality, because if you say someone's funny, for
Mm-hmm.
example, and you think about all of the different types of comedy, that's not really an accurate way to describe someone's personality, right? Like, because it's not enough.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think you're hitting on this piece where there are these broader stroke terms and descriptions for, okay, what are things we think about for a person's personality? What makes up traits about them? So a person's sense of humor, their sense of loyalty, um, their ability to connect and relate to other people. We could spend hours just listing different ways of describing people and what their personalities might be like. And at the same time, you also made a really good point that some of it's more these broad strokes descriptions, but then you can also get into the nitty gritty of who a person themselves actually is. And so a sense of loyalty could look very different between different people, even if they're both extremely loyal. For one of them, it might mean that they would take a bullet for you. For another one, it might mean that they're there for you during those emotionally hard times, right? Those could both be seen as very loyal people, but it on the outside looks very different.
That's true. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so
This
personality is tricky. There's actually this whole subgroup of psychologists who educate and do research and all this stuff called personality psychologists. And they try to measure and look at an individual person. So when we look at individual people, what makes up individual people? How do we know things about each one of us in who we are?
that's so. Does that overlap at all with like philosophy or
So philosophy overlaps with psychology just in general quite a
okay?
bit. Um, I feel like in a lot of ways, psychology is almost trying to apply a lot of philosophical concepts
Right,
to
that makes
real life and
sense.
help us function amongst all of those unanswered questions. There's definitely a lot of overlap between psychology and a number of different fields. So, for sure, philosophy, what is it to exist? What is it to be a person? How much are you an unchanging entity versus a changing force over time? So, you are Keaton.
Sometimes.
Sometimes you were Keaton at age 5, and yet there were probably things very drastically different at age 5 versus now. And you probably both feel like there's a lot of change, and yet you're also Keaton, right? So there is a very philosophical
Yeah.
component to a lot of psychology. There's also overlap with sociology, which is more about how societies maneuver. So looking at things more from a stepping back perspective. Communications, there's a ton of overlap. How we communicate with people, psychologists work on that. People within communication field do. There's a lot of actually different fields that can focus on these things. I'm admittedly most familiar with the psychology component. Um, when it comes to personality psychology, when we talk about personality, we do tend to think of, okay, more of those stable types of characteristics. When we talk about someone's personality, a lot of times too, we're thinking about um, how they think, how they feel, how they react, rather than what they look like, right? We don't think of, oh, their personality is that they have blue eyes, or their personality is that, I don't know, they're 5'3", right? So we think
Yeah.
more about how a person thinks, behaves, reacts to the world.
Yeah, because like and it's one of those things you're right. It is hard to describe because like I remember like I used to know someone and I'll be honest, the guy was just like a jerk. He just uncomfortable to be around, just like rubbed you the wrong way like
Mm,
sandpaper, but he was also extremely benevolent, like very giving,
ah, yeah,
very generous, extremely charitable. And so, based off of that, you could say, oh, he was a very kind person.
yeah, yeah.
But hanging out with him, you would not say the same thing, right?
Interesting.
And so,
Yeah,
yeah. And so that's
yeah,
really, oh gosh, this is breaking my brain.
yeah. Personality is one of those things we take for granted. But if someone said, so in psychology, it's, oh, how do we operationally define something? So how do we define something in an exact way where you, me, and a random stranger down the street would all be talking about the exact same thing? We'd all be ideally measuring the exact same thing. And so that gets really tricky when we look at individual people and what makes up that person's personality. And so I was thinking about this as we were talking about, okay, well, Ben Affleck's versus Michael Keaton's versus Christian Bale, right? Like these different ways of portraying Bruce Wayne, and some admittedly having little differences in their stories as well. But we talked about just variations in who they are, and some of them more closely aligned with each other than others. So when it comes to personality, one of the most popular ways, at least in the United States and other cultures that are pretty similar to our own, because the more similar your culture is to another culture,
Right.
the more you can measure things the same, right?
Like
So
cultural relativism, like, yeah,
yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
we're learning more, and we're doing better about not saying this is true for everyone because this is how it is in the United States. We're
right,
getting better about saying this is how it is in the United States. So for example, Great Britain, a lot of times you'll see similar things, or Canada in particular, you tend to see pretty similar things, right? So there are certain cultures that are more similar to each other, and we're getting better about saying, okay, well, at least over here, this seems to be working. And then we have other researchers in other countries that then take it and say, does it work in this other culture? So,
right.
at least for us, one of the most popular, if not the most popular way of measuring personality is the big five. So, what they did was they said, let's look at all of these different ways that we use to describe people, and let's try to group them into these smaller boxes, smaller categories, like how much, which of these hang together. And so they came up with five. Some people argue more recently for six, but I'm just going to stick to the big five for today for simplicity's sake.
Okay.
So we have extroversion, which most people have heard of, extroversion versus introversion. So each of these have like some smaller pieces to them. So like extroversion, think about how sociable is a person. How assertive are they with other people? What's their energy level like? So the more energetic a person tends to be, the more assertive they tend to be, the more sociable they tend to be, the higher in extroversion they tend to be. Then there's agreeableness. So with agreeableness, we're talking about things like compassion, how respectful is a person, how trusting they are. So agreeableness, there's this is so you were talking about someone where how do you see them? Do you see them as someone who's really caring and generous and whatnot? A lot of times we think of that agreeableness aligns with that. Then we have conscientiousness. So this is more how organized are you? How productive are you? How responsible? So you might think of some of the, if we think like type A characteristics that we might think of for people, someone who tends to be more structured, organized, reliable, all that kind of stuff. Then there's what was called neuroticism. I've also seen more recently negative emotionality. So, this is how prone is someone to feeling negative versus positive emotions. So, how likely is someone that they experience anxiety, depression, or emotional ups and downs a lot? So, how much does a person tend to experience those negative emotional experiences? Then the last one's open-mindedness. So this is how intellectually curious someone might be, how creative someone might be, how imaginative, how artistic or drawn to different aesthetic things that a person might be. So you've got extroversion, you've got agreeableness, you've got conscientiousness, you've got negative emotionality, and open mindedness.
Okay.
Now, obviously, like humor, well, where
Mhm.
does that lie? So it's not a perfect system, and it's not going to tell
Right.
you necessarily all the nuances. But what they found with tons of research is that you really can see that people tend to, over time, pretty well hang at certain levels. You'll see changes over time that naturally happen with age. But overall, a person can be fairly stable in how they are with these big five traits.
Looking at it as like a stat sheet on like a D&D profile.
Yes. In fact, so I love that you said that because I actually, as a fun little exercise, I almost thought of it in that way for the different Bruce Waynes.
Oh, okay.
So let's talk about the different Bruce Waynes with the big five.
Okay.
Um, okay. Extroversion. So this is like how sociable you are, how assertive you are, what's like your energy level kind of thing. I think this is one that you see some variability between our Bruce Waynes.
Absolutely. I think that as far as like extrovertedness goes, I feel like Clooney
Oh my
is
god, me too. Yes.
top of the bar for that one,
Yep.
right?
Oh, absolutely. There's this vibe he gives off that, yeah, he seems very suave. He doesn't seem to mind at all being out and about
I think he's just
doing.
George Clooney. Like
I
he's
know.
not
It's hard to note
he's,
how much of it is George Clooney,
he's
how
just
much of it is, you know.
I love
But
it.
I'm totally with you. I think he is one of the more extroverted. I
Yeah.
think Christian Bale is too.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Well, the thing here's the thing about Chris, because the thing is with Clooney, I felt like he wasn't pretending.
Very fair point. Yeah. How much was
Versus
Christian Bale's
versus
pretending?
Bale's, I feel like everything with Bale was like an act. Like, okay, I'm gonna pretend
That's
to
a
be
fair point.
Bruce. Like, I'm gonna pretend to be outlandish Bruce Wayne. Like that's the only thing about Bale's. I feel as
That's
yeah.
a fair point. And so I think that can be one of the tricky things is what is the persona versus what is the true Bruce Wayne underneath. I think that's a really good point. George
Yeah.
Clooney's, I agree with you, feels much more pure. This is a because you see some similar ways that he interacts with Dick Grayson and with
Hmm.
Alfred
Yeah.
compared to how he is when he's out and about versus Christian Bale. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Versus Robert Pattinson, that dude
Which
is
and
not
we
an extrovert.
and it's hard to gauge him too, because just like you said, 5-year-old Keaton versus me now, like Robert
Hmm.
Pattinson is 5-year-old Batman. Like he's
Very
he's
good
like
point.
he's it's like yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely one who really struggles to be around other people, but that's also a fair point that he's very much in a developmental stage. And
Yeah.
so,
He's Batman all the time. Like he never
yeah,
turns it off.
he never turns it off.
Yeah.
So, how much of this, as he naturally becomes more balanced and learns and becomes more confident in what is Batman, what is Bruce Wayne, I wonder if that
Hopefully Selena can
extroversion could
help him out.
shift.
We'll
There
see.
you go.
We'll
There you
see.
go. There you go. So what about agreeableness? Okay. So agreeableness, these are things like being respectful, being trustworthy, having compassion, um, yeah. But I want to hear from you before I tell you how I was thinking about this.
That's a good one. So yeah, because honestly, I feel like most of the Bruce Waynes do a pretty good job of it as far as what we've seen in the media. Like in as far as like the movies go, gosh, I'm thinking like because they always talk about how giving Bale's Wayne was pretty giving and like
Yeah, that's a fair point.
yeah he was pretty giving and like it was but at the same time going back to Clooney I mean he was showing up at like gala events and uh donating money as Batman.
So yeah, here's the thing about Bruce Wayne. I feel like he projects all of his agreeableness into I do my duties. I give money, I fight crime, da da da. And so it fluctuates. Like Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne, I think is an agreeable guy. Val
Yeah.
Kilmer's seems like an agreeable guy.
Val Kilmer was yeah okay yeah
Those seem
definitely
agreeable. But if you think about George Clooney, he's always pissing somebody off as Bruce Wayne in his personal life. In his personal life, Dick Grayson has to kind of fight for some room to be heard. Um, Christian Bale, his Alfred ends up, walking off on him. He grows tired of. So I think the portrayals of Bruce Wayne in the comics, there's a little bit more variability where you see more of the disagreeableness coming up. But I
absolutely.
think you get hints of it with some of the movie versions.
Well, here,
When he's like in the Batcave, when he's
yeah,
because he cares obviously because he does
right.
Batman,
But this is what,
but
yeah.
he's
Well,
a
this is
tricky
where it
guy to
gets
be around.
difficult. It gets
Yeah.
difficult with the agreeableness because you got to think about the fact that the real Bruce Wayne is Batman. And then think about how he interacts with the Justice League, and it's like, he's
See,
not,
there you go.
he's not very
So
agreeable.
let's take Ben Affleck. He prides himself in not being, he's not, I
He was
wouldn't
a
say he's
nice Batman in
disagreeable.
that Justice League. He was so much nicer than like
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, I
standard
don't I
Bats.
don't think I don't think he's disagreeable,
Right,
but I don't think he's super agreeable either, and I think he likes it that way.
right.
I think I totally agree with you. Ben Affleck kind of hints at some other versions, but yeah, he likes as Batman, as Bruce Wayne, or he likes to keep people on their toes. And if you're a really agreeable person, it's hard to be Batman
You
and
don't
be
know what you're
really
gonna get, right?
agreeable, you know?
Right.
So yeah, I I just feel like if you're Batman long enough, if you're Batman long enough, you're gonna end up like Frank Miller's, and you're gonna be a
Okay,
disagreeable old grump.
you literally read my mind. I'm like, because I'm like, if we look at old man Batman, like he got worse.
Yeah, he does
He
not
was an
age well,
ornery old man.
right? So Ben Affleck, you see it in Batman versus Superman, and granted, then he backtracks and whatnot, but you see it in Batman versus Superman. He's totally disagreeable in that. In fact, Alfred's just off drinking all the time, making little comments at him because he's so tired of everything, right? So yeah, Bruce Wayne doesn't age well in terms of the agreeableness.
Yeah, I just remember like thinking about like even the animated
Oh yeah.
universe with Old Man Bruce and Batman Beyond.
Mm-hmm. Another great example of an aged Bruce Wayne. Absolutely. So, conscientiousness. I feel like conscientiousness is one that probably doesn't vary much across
Okay.
the Batmans, unless we're talking about Christian Bale giving up on everything at the end of Dark Knight Rises. I see you rolling your eyes. I had to tweak the knife in for you a little bit. So conscientiousness, we're talking about being responsible, organized, productive. I mean, I feel like the obsessiveness of Bruce Wayne that has to be there in order to effectively be Batman. I'm kind of figuring they all have to be really conscientious, don't you? Or is there any exceptions that you can think of?
I feel like, as far as what we've seen in the movies, we got a chance to see that more between Val Kilmer and
Mm,
Christian Bale,
yeah.
especially when you see Val like going through and like talking to the different members of Wayne Enterprises and listening to sales
Mm,
pitches from like Nigma and all of
yeah. Yeah,
that.
you
Like
got to see it outside of Batman with
yeah,
him. That's
which was
right.
that was, and I always thought that was cool, like seeing like, okay, this guy's still the one that's like in charge, making the decisions. No, we're not gonna go that route.
Yep.
And the thing that was also very different about that too is like the difference between that Bruce Wayne versus Bale's Wayne, it was a lot more dealing with him versus the board, right?
That's
Because it
true.
was a public company.
And actually
Whereas,
for
yeah,
him, he actually looked low in conscientiousness.
yeah.
And actually this hits on a really good point where there are versions of Bruce Wayne that kind of let things slide with the business. They're focused so much on being responsible with Batman that they let the other stuff slide cuz
I mean,
Christian
that's what
Bale lets a
happened with
lot of things
Bales.
happen. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Where um, I think that's one of those complicating pieces about some of these things where um so one of the pieces about personality too is they say that, well, how do we explain situations where a person might be totally different in one situation versus another. Like how you are at work might be different with how you are at home. How different you are at work might depend on what your job is. And versus how you are at home and how acceptable it might be to cross those over. But so one thing I was reading was essentially talking about how um, you know part of it is how much of your natural personality or how much of that is able to be expressed in a situation,
Mhm.
right? So it's not the person's personality per se that's changing necessarily, but certain parts of their personality might be more or less expressed in different types of situations. And so I wonder if that's one of the things coming out with Christian Bale,
Right.
because he's so hyper focused on Batman that the Wayne Enterprises falls apart.
And one thing I am noticing about this too is that when you gauge someone's personality, it also depends on the judge, right? Because like
Mm,
we're sitting here breaking it down like person by
yeah,
person, but like just say if it were just one of us instead of us talking it through and grading them, we might give different grades just because we are
that's true.
different people with different personalities.
So I actually well, and the interesting thing too is a lot of times with measuring things related to personality, or psychology in general, when we're asking people about themselves, a lot of times we're doing self-reports. And there are limits to that. So there are arguments to be said for how much is who a person is what they see of themselves versus what how much of who they are is what they do.
Hmm.
I mean, how much of it is how other people perceive them? There's a lot of complications with how to measure this stuff too, and so a lot of times it's self-report. There's actually the link to an article we have attached to this episode. There's a link in there where you can take a personality test, and I took it for myself just because I was interested in because I did it long ago when I was in undergrad. I thought of having you and me both do it for some of the Bruce Waynes, but I'm pretty sure that because of some of the information it anonymously asks you for, I think it might be research. And I was like, okay, I don't want to mess up
Don't
someone's
want to just
research by
excuse someone's
by
research
goofing
off by
off.
Frank Miller's
Yeah,
Batman, Tom King's Batman.
exactly. Can
Like,
you imagine if I screwed up someone's research because I just had so many people guess what they think different Bruce Wayne's
it's like,
personalities would
why are
be?
there
Yeah. So
9
I
people
didn't have
named
us
Bruce
do that.
Wayne in this study?
But you have a good point. So us talking it over, we might come up with different things than if we were on our own. And these also could very well be different than what Bruce Wayne himself would market as for himself. It'd be really cool if, the actors as they're portraying them took these and figured out their big five. That'd be really cool. Okay, we got two more.
2 more.
So, negative emotionality is essentially how prone to feeling anxiety and depression, and also just emotional ups and downs a person might have. So, I know the ones that stand out for me in terms of who might have more of this, but
Okay,
I'm
can I
I'm
see if I
curious.
can guess?
Yeah, I'm curious
All
to
right.
see what your thoughts are.
So I'm thinking Pattinson
Oh yeah, of course.
and maybe Keaton, Michael Keaton's.
You know what's funny is right before you said that, I was like, oh yeah, and Keaton. You're totally right. Keaton, he is a subtle one.
Yeah.
So,
You thinking Bale?
oh yeah.
Bale. Okay.
Uh-huh. Bale
Okay.
was my other one. Yeah, you
I
and
was
me, we're
torn
we're there.
between Keaton and Bale. I
Yeah.
knew
Yeah.
Pattinson was one, but
Oh, he's
then
got
2 and
emo
3.
Batman, emo Bruce
Yeah, but
Wayne. Come
then
on.
2 and 3 I'm like, is it Bale or Keaton? Cuz I could
Yep.
see.
So, emo Bruce Wayne, of course, right? Like that. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on for him. He's probably got more of the depression, maybe some anxiety stuff going on. Keaton, yeah, he's a subtler, softer version, but he does. I mean, there's a lot of psychological stuff going on for him. You can tell that he, in some ways, I think, is a little more tender-hearted about some stuff and is, just dealing with the reverberations. Some of the others, I bet it's there. They just cover it up more, or maybe you don't see it as much. Like George Clooney, maybe you don't see it as much because his extroversion is distracting from it too much, right? But yeah, Bale, I think he's got that emotional up and down kind of. He's probably the one that could benefit from some anger management, I think. Yeah. uh Open-mindedness. This is the one that I felt like Bruce Wayne just has to be off the charts no matter what. Just like conscientiousness, where it's so how intellectually curious, how creative and imaginative are you, how drawn into and how sensitive are you to like aesthetics and artistic stuff and whatnot. I feel like you have to be all those things to be the world's greatest detective and do the Batman thing.
Yeah.
But if you have if you are thinking something else, definitely let me know.
Well, I guess the best way I can think about gauging that is looking at who did, like, which ones did like the best detective work and like
Ah,
thinking
I like
outside the
it.
box. Honestly, as far as detective work goes, I feel like we saw Pattinson do more of it.
He's still growing in it, but I
Yeah.
agree with you that you see so like Clooney, all you see are gadgets. You don't
Well,
really see much
I was gonna
thinking.
say he did come up with the rubber lips to counteract poison ivy,
Okay, that is
and
imaginative. I will give you that. Okay, okay. Maybe
gotta
all
respect
okay.
that.
I gotta respect the gadgets. I get they seem silly to me, but maybe that's just his aesthetic for these
So I
things.
always think about that scene in the movie because I remember Robin in that scene. I was like, his lips are really big. And then it's like rubber lips.
Oh,
It's like rubber lips. I'm like, oh, that's why. And then the lips underneath were even more pink. And I'm like, okay, I
that's
got nothing.
hilarious. That's hilarious. Okay, you've won me over. I was thinking that George Clooney might be the least because he's they're all the gadgets, and it's more of like a showy, goofy version. But it's a good
So
point.
goofy.
It actually highlights that he's very imaginative with his gadgets. So that's a fair point. So, but once again, I think that that hits on, so different Bruce Waynes might be open minded in different ways.
Mm,
So they all have to be very open minded to do the job and not die within like 2 days, or just be so bad that you don't get anywhere with it.
right,
But some of them might be more the detective, intellectual curiosity. Others might be more like creative, imaginative, gadgety type.
right.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. But honestly, like, yeah, because I also thought about Bale's Batman.
Mm,
And like, he's like, huh, so it's an army tank. I could drive that on a roof. Like, like he's like,
mm.
like that. And like how he came up with like, well, Lucius came up with it, but he was the
I
one
was
that used it to like find the Joker. He's like, I'm going to use every cell phone in Gotham and just turn it on like
so,
sonar.
I was just thinking that exact thing, that Lucius Fox perhaps is key to Christian
Absolutely.
Bale's Bruce Wayne success. So that's actually something that detracts a little bit for me in terms of his version. And you know what? Because we've had this conversation, who's your favorite Batman? Da, 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 da. I think I'm realizing that maybe he didn't have as much of the detective stuff, and he didn't have as much of the creating the gadgets and that sort of thing. Maybe that's why he doesn't naturally draw me in as much as some of the others, because he doesn't
Yeah.
quite have as much of that flair.
And like, I feel, and the thing is, like, I remember when, like, in a lot of the Batman movies, you don't see a lot of the detective work. Like
Yeah,
it
it's
seems
hard
like
in
the detective work
movies.
is like it seems like it's reserved for comics, but at the same time,
It's You've got more time and space in the comics,
well,
though.
I'm not gonna give them that out because I'm
Okay,
like, you can make a Sherlock Holmes movie, and
okay, that's fair.
like how many seasons of CSI are there out there, right? Like
But
I
that's a
can
TV
get
show.
yeah, but like I mean, it's just one of those things. I'm like, I can you can
Yeah,
give me some detective work, and they do it a little. I will say they do it a
yeah.
little. Like I remember Bale like tests the ballistics on a gun at one
Mm.
point in The Dark Knight. Like I remember he did that, and like
Keaton. Keaton is always in the Batcave looking over
studying
stuff. And I feel
something.
like
Yeah,
Kilmer's might have too.
yeah,
But yeah, more of the studious shots in the Batcave are
yeah.
always useful for that sort of thing. So I think those helped. Yeah,
Yeah,
had a little bit
it
of a.
seems like they still focus more on he's just like the ultimate hand-to-hand combat fighter, and I'm like, yeah,
Mm,
but and he has cool gadgets and he's rich, but I'm like, it's
yeah,
up here
yeah,
too.
yeah.
For listeners, I just pointed at my brain. I got to remember that sometime.
Good job, Keaton. Good job. So this was the big five.
Okay,
One way of measuring personality.
I
None
like
of these
that.
things are perfect, but yeah, a walk through our. I guess we didn't really talk Adam West much with a lot of these. I apologize to any big fans of Adam West. I am
Well,
least familiar with him.
we just you can't include perfection
There you go.
when trying to recognize faults.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JVS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.